The Russell Senate Office Building's Committee Room 216 had witnessed countless political confrontations throughout its storied history, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold on this Tuesday afternoon in March. The Senate Judiciary Committee's hearing on voting rights legislation had been scheduled as a routine policy discussion, but the tension between two of the committee's most prominent members had been building for weeks. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, serving as a special witness due to her expertise in civil rights law, sat at the witness table with her characteristic poise and preparation. Across from her, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina occupied his committee seat with the confidence of someone who had never faced a truly challenging opponent in a public forum. The hearing room was packed with journalists, advocacy group representatives, and curious Capitol Hill staff members who sensed that today's session might produce something more dramatic than standard legislative testimony. Scott had specifically requested the opportunity to question Crockett, ostensibly about voting rights policy, but clearly intending to challenge her broader political agenda. His reputation as a skilled questioner and his position as one of the Republican Party's most prominent African-American voices made him a formidable opponent for any witness. However, his confidence was built on the assumption that his carefully crafted public persona was impenetrable and that his private life would remain private. The first 2 hours of the hearing proceeded as expected, with committee members asking predictable questions about voter access, election security, and federal versus state authority over election administration. Crockett's responses were thorough, well-documented, and delivered with the precision of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly these kinds of policy discussions. Her expertise was evident in every answer, and even Republican committee members seemed impressed by her command of constitutional law and election administration details. Scott had remained largely silent during these exchanges, taking notes and occasionally whispering with staff members. His questions, when they came, were clearly intended to be the hearing's climactic moment. He had prepared what he believed would be a devastating critique of Crockett's positions and her broader political philosophy. His confidence was palpable as he leaned into his microphone and began what he assumed would be his victory lap. "Congresswoman Crockett," Scott began, his voice carrying the authority of his senatorial position, "you've testified today about the importance of voting rights and equal protection under the law. But I'm concerned that your approach to these issues reflects a broader pattern of divisive rhetoric that actually undermines the unity and traditional values that have made America strong." The room shifted forward slightly, sensing that the real confrontation was about to begin. Crockett's expression remained neutral, but those who knew her well might have noticed a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was shifting into combat mode. "Could you elaborate on that concern, Senator?" She replied calmly. "I'm always interested in feedback about how to better serve the American people and protect constitutional rights." Scott's confidence grew as he continued his attack. "What I'm talking about is the tendency among some politicians to prioritize ideological purity over practical solutions and to attack the family values and moral foundations that have traditionally guided American society. We need leaders who understand that strong families and traditional moral principles are the bedrock of a healthy democracy." The irony of his words would become apparent within minutes. But for now, Scott seemed pleased with his rhetorical positioning. He was presenting himself as the defender of traditional values, while casting Crockett as a radical who threatened American social stability. It was a familiar script that had served him well throughout his political career. "I find that interesting, Senator Scott," Crockett replied, her fingers drumming lightly against the folder that sat closed in front of her. "Since you've raised the question of family values and moral leadership, perhaps we should examine what those concepts actually mean in practice." She paused, her eyes meeting his directly across the hearing room. "I'm particularly interested in your perspective on authenticity and honesty in public service, especially when it comes to the consistency between our public positions and our private lives." The committee room fell silent as the personal nature of the exchange became clear. This was no longer a policy debate. It was about to become something much more intimate and potentially devastating. Scott's confident expression flickered slightly, a momentary uncertainty that suggested he sensed danger but couldn't yet identify its source. I'm not sure what you're implying, Congresswoman. I've been completely consistent in my commitment to the values and principles I've articulated throughout my career in public service. Have you? Crockett reached into her folder and withdrew what appeared to be a thick private investigator's report, bound in a manila cover marked with official seals. Because I have documentation that suggests a significant disconnect between your public advocacy for traditional family values and the reality of your private life over the past decade. The silence in committee room 216 was complete. Journalists leaned forward in their seats. Committee members stopped their routine paper shuffling, and even the usually bustling staff members along the walls froze in place. Everyone sensed they were about to witness something unprecedented in congressional hearing history. What you're looking at, Crockett continued, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, is a comprehensive investigation report compiled by Meridian Security Associates, one of the nation's most reputable private investigation firms. The investigation was commissioned 6 months ago by concerned constituents in South Carolina who were troubled by rumors and inconsistencies in your public statements about your personal life. Scott's face went pale as the implications of her words began to sink in. Any such investigation would be a violation of privacy and probably based on fabricated information designed to damage my reputation. Actually, Senator, the investigation was conducted using entirely legal methods and public records, supplemented by voluntary interviews with individuals who have knowledge of your private activities. Crockett opened the report and removed several photographs, placing them face down on the table in front of her. Given your emphasis on traditional family values and your criticism of others' moral standards, I think the committee and the American people deserve to understand the full context of your moral authority. Her hand hovered over the photographs like an executioner's axe. Senator Scott, you've been married to Francis Scott for 15 years, and you've built much of your political brand on being a devoted family man who represents traditional Christian values. You've criticized LGBTQ plus rights legislation, opposed marriage equality, and consistently positioned yourself as a defender of what you call biblical family structures. Scott's composure was beginning to crack visibly. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead, despite the committee room's aggressive air conditioning. That's correct, and I stand by my commitment to traditional family values and biblical principles. I find it unfortunate that you would resort to personal attacks rather than engaging with the policy issues we're here to discuss. Crockett turned over the first photograph, angling it so the committee members and journalists could see it clearly. This photograph was taken on March 15th of last year at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Washington, D.C. It shows you entering a private suite with Marcus Hamilton, a 34-year-old political consultant who has been your regular companion for the past 10 years. The gasps that filled the committee room were audible throughout the building. Several committee members appeared genuinely shocked, while others seemed to be processing information they had perhaps suspected but never seen confirmed. The photograph was clear and unmistakable, showing Scott in an intimate conversation with a younger man as they entered what was obviously a hotel room together. But Crockett was just beginning her systematic destruction of Scott's carefully constructed public persona. She turned over a second photograph, this one showing Scott and Hamilton at what appeared to be a private dinner in an upscale restaurant. This is from February 8th of this year at Le Bernardin in New York City. According to the restaurant's records, you reserved a private dining room under Hamilton's name and stayed until nearly midnight. The receipt, which I have here, shows that you paid for dinner using a credit card tied to a joint account that you share with Mr. Hamilton. The revelation that Scott maintained a joint financial account with another man while publicly opposing LGBTQ plus rights sent shockwaves through the committee room. Several journalists were frantically typing on their phones, understanding that they were witnessing a career-ending moment in real time. The hypocrisy was staggering. A senator who had built his reputation on defending traditional marriage while secretly maintaining what appeared to be a decade-long romantic relationship with another man. Scott's attempts to respond were increasingly desperate and incoherent. These photographs are taken completely out of context. Marcus Hamilton is a political consultant who has worked on various projects with my office. There's nothing inappropriate about our professional relationship. Professional relationship? Crockett produced another document from her folder. This is a copy of a lease agreement for a private residence in Georgetown that you and Mr. Hamilton have shared for the past 18 months. The lease lists both of you as primary residents, and according to utility records, you've been splitting household expenses equally. She paused, allowing the full weight of the evidence to settle over the stunned committee room. Senator, this goes far beyond a professional relationship. You've been living with another man while publicly campaigning against the rights of LGBTQ plus Americans to do exactly the same thing. The committee room erupted into chaos as the magnitude of Scott's hypocrisy became clear. He wasn't just a closeted gay man in a party that opposed gay rights. He had been actively working to deny others the very freedoms he was secretly exercising in his own life. The moral authority he had claimed on family values issues was revealed to be built on a foundation of lies and self-hatred. But Crockett's most devastating revelation was still to come. She reached into her folder again and produced what appeared to be financial records marked with bank letterheads. There's something else the committee should know about Senator Scott's commitment to honesty and transparency. These are financial records showing payments totaling $2.3 million made over the past 5 years to various individuals and organizations to maintain secrecy about his relationship with Mr. Hamilton. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. This wasn't shock or surprise. This was the sound of witnessing someone's entire public identity disintegrate in real time. The revelation that Scott had spent over $2 million to hide his sexuality while publicly opposing LGBTQ+ rights represented a level of hypocrisy that was almost incomprehensible. Scott sat motionless in his committee chair, his face cycling through emotions, shock, fear, anger, and what appeared to be relief that his secret was finally exposed. The weight of maintaining such a fundamental deception for over a decade had clearly taken an enormous psychological toll, and part of him seemed grateful that the charade was finally ending. Crockett continued methodically, her voice maintaining the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the hearing. The payments include $400,000 to a private security firm to monitor potential sources of information about your relationship, $600,000 to various media consultants to suppress stories, and $1.3 million in what can only be described as hush money to individuals who had knowledge of your private life. She held up a canceled check made out for $150,000. This particular payment was made to a former hotel employee who had witnessed you and Mr. Hamilton in compromising situations during multiple stays at various Washington hotels. The committee room was in complete upheaval. Republican members sat in stunned silence, processing the destruction of one of their party's most prominent voices on social issues. Democratic members appeared genuinely shocked by the scope of the deception and the amounts of money involved in maintaining it. Journalists were filing stories in real time, understanding that they were witnessing one of the most significant political scandals in recent memory. Committee chairman asked Scott if he wanted to respond to the allegations, but Scott seemed incapable of forming coherent sentences. His political career, built over decades of careful image management and moral positioning, was crumbling in real time before a national audience. Crockett delivered her final statement with the gravity of someone who understood the historical significance of the moment. Senator Scott, you came here today to lecture me about family values and moral leadership. You questioned my commitment to traditional principles while building your entire political brand on a foundation of lies and hypocrisy. She gestured to the evidence spread across the table. You've spent over $2 million to hide a relationship that represents everything you've publicly opposed. You've denied other Americans the rights you've secretly exercised while profiting politically from their oppression. Most tragically, you've lived a life of such fundamental dishonesty that you've lost sight of what authentic moral leadership actually means. The committee room erupted in sustained applause from the public gallery, with many people standing to show their support for Crockett's devastating exposure of Scott's hypocrisy. The applause continued for several minutes, forcing the committee chairman to repeatedly call for order. Social media exploded in real time as clips of the exchange began circulating globally. Within an hour of the hearing's conclusion, hashtags like Scott Exposed and Hypocrisy Revealed were trending worldwide, and the photographs and financial documents had been viewed millions of times across various platforms. The immediate aftermath was swift and decisive. Within 24 hours of the hearing, Scott announced that he would not seek re-election and would be resigning from all committee positions effective immediately. Republican leadership, faced with an untenable situation, accepted his resignation without public comment. Conservative groups that had previously celebrated Scott as a moral leader began distancing themselves from him, while LGBTQ+ advocacy organizations expressed a complex mixture of sympathy for his personal struggle and outrage at his political hypocrisy. The revelation also triggered broader discussions about the psychological costs of living in denial of one's authentic identity while publicly opposing the rights of others in similar situations. Mental health experts noted that Scott's behavior represented a textbook case of internalized homophobia and the destructive effects of maintaining such fundamental deceptions over extended periods. For the Republican Party, Scott's downfall represented a crisis of credibility on social issues. One of their most prominent voices on family values had been exposed as living a secret life that contradicted everything he publicly advocated. The incident forced party leaders to confront uncomfortable questions about the authenticity of their moral positions and the sustainability of their social conservative coalition. 3 months after the Senate hearing, Scott and Hamilton moved together to a private residence in Vermont, where Scott began working for a nonprofit organization focused on LGBTQ+ youth suicide prevention. In a statement released through the organization, Scott acknowledged the pain his political positions had caused and expressed his commitment to making amends for the harm he had inflicted on the LGBTQ+ community. For Jasmine, the encounter represented another milestone in her career as a political truth-teller, but it also raised complex questions about the ethics of exposing someone's private life, even when that person had built their career on opposing others' rights to live authentically. She addressed these concerns in subsequent interviews, arguing that public officials who campaign on moral issues forfeit their right to privacy when their private lives contradict their public positions. The broader impact on American political discourse was significant and lasting. The Scott exposure demonstrated that in an era of increased surveillance and opposition research, maintaining false public personas had become nearly impossible for public figures. Politicians could no longer assume that their private lives would remain private, particularly when those lives contradicted their public positions on moral and social issues. The incident also highlighted the particular challenges faced by LGBTQ+ individuals in conservative political movements. Scott's story became a cautionary tale about the costs of denying one's authentic identity for political gain and the impossibility of sustaining such fundamental deceptions over time. LGBTQ+ advocacy groups used his example to illustrate the destructive effects of internalized homophobia and the importance of authentic representation in political leadership. 6 months after the hearing, academic institutions began incorporating the Scott case into political science and ethics curricula as an example of how personal authenticity and public integrity intersected in contemporary American politics. The case raised fundamental questions about the relationship between private morality and public leadership, and whether politicians had obligations to live according to the principles they advocated for others. For Scott personally, the exposure represented both a devastating professional collapse and a potential path toward authentic living. While his political career was permanently destroyed, he was finally freed from the burden of maintaining a false public persona that had clearly caused him significant psychological distress for over a decade. His subsequent work with LGBTQ+ youth represented an attempt to make amends for the harm his political positions had caused and to find meaning in authentic service rather than political performance. The Georgetown residence he shared with Hamilton became a symbol of the life he could have lived openly if he had possessed the courage to be authentic from the beginning of his political career. The tragedy of his story wasn't just the hypocrisy of his political positions, but the decades of self-denial and internalized shame that had prevented him from living authentically while serving in public office. As both Jasmine and Scott moved forward in their respective post-scandal lives, the lessons of that Senate hearing remained with them and with American political culture more broadly. Jasmine had demonstrated once again that thorough research and strategic revelation could expose even the most carefully guarded secrets when public officials' private lives contradicted their public positions. Scott had learned that authentic living, while personally liberating, came at enormous professional and social costs when it contradicted the expectations of one's political coalition. The Senate hearing between Jasmine Crockett and Tim Scott would be remembered as a defining moment in discussions about authenticity, hypocrisy, and moral leadership in American politics. It showed that even the most carefully constructed public personas could be destroyed when they were built on foundations of deception and self-denial. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the courage to live authentically, while often costly, was ultimately the only sustainable foundation for genuine moral leadership in democratic society.